Greetings, friend, and welcome. So glad you could join us for Bedtime Biographies, where together we unwind and drift away to the soothing accounts of truly remarkable lives. Our journey this evening begins in early 20th century America. The air smells of fresh-cut hay and strict Protestant devotion, and a quiet farm boy sits alone in the barn watching his parents prize cattle with unusual fascination. His name, Carl Rogers. His mission, to prove that people, like those animals, grow naturally toward their potential when given the right conditions. Before we properly begin Rogers' story, just a brief thought. If these calm explorations of significant lives help you unwind, please consider taking a moment to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps other curious minds discover these stories. And we're always curious for your reflections. Let us know in the comments below what you think of Rogers and which historical figure you'd like us to explore in our next bedtime biography. Now, client-centered therapy gets thrown around a lot in psychology courses, sometimes as jargon, sometimes as common sense dressed up in academic language. But strip away the noise, and at its heart, it's really just a question. What if we trusted people to heal themselves? What if the therapist's job wasn't to fix, diagnose, or direct, but simply to listen with such complete acceptance that the person could finally hear their own inner wisdom? Rogers spent his life chasing that radical idea through religious rebellion, academic battles, and experiments that would reshape how we understand the human mind. Of course, history took his theories in unexpected directions. Encounter groups, self-help movements, corporate team-building exercises, both profound and absurd. But tonight, we're not here for the spin-offs. We're just here to meet the man behind the unconditional positive regard. A gentle, stubborn, deeply curious soul who believed in human goodness when behaviorism said we were just sophisticated rats and psychoanalysis said we were cauldrons of dark impulses. And now, as the day winds down, let's begin to trace the life and times of this quietly revolutionary thinker. This is the bedtime biography of Carl Rogers. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Learned to Listen to Corn. The story begins in 1902 in Oak Park, Illinois, a respectable suburb where conformity and Christianity walked hand in hand down tree-lined streets. Here, in a household that prized work, discipline, and Bible study above all else, a boy named Carl Ransom Rogers learned his first lessons about human nature. His father, Walter, was a civil engineer with fundamentalist convictions and a love of scientific agriculture. His mother, Julia, was devout to the point of suffocation, the kind of woman who considered dancing, drinking, and card-playing the devil's playground. Young Carl absorbed it all: the prayers before meals, the prohibition against worldly friendships, the sense that pleasure itself was vaguely suspect. The Rogers household didn't exactly hum with warmth. Affection was rationed like wartime butter, and emotions were something to be controlled, not expressed. Carl, the fourth of 6 children, responded by becoming what sensitive children often become in rigid homes: very, very quiet, and very, very observant. At age 12, the family moved to a 30-acre farm west of Chicago. Walter Rogers, ever the practical engineer, ran the place like an agricultural experiment station. Young Carl found himself surrounded by chickens, pigs, and dairy cattle, and, by extension, mountains of literature about scientific farming. While other boys played baseball, Carl devoured agricultural journals, learning about selective breeding, optimal growing conditions, and the precise pH balance needed for healthy soil. Here's the thing nobody tells you about Carl Rogers' origin story. His revolutionary ideas about human potential were born watching potatoes. Seriously. The boy noticed that when you gave plants the right conditions, good soil, adequate water, proper sunlight, they didn't need to be forced to grow. They just grew, toward health, toward their fullest expression. A moth-eaten tuber in optimal conditions would become a robust plant without any coercion whatsoever. It was a radical thought for a boy raised in a household where human nature was considered fundamentally fallen and in need of constant correction. What if people were more like those potatoes than his parents believed? What if we had an inherent tendency toward growth rather than sin? Of course, the teenage Carl couldn't articulate this yet. For now, he was simply a lonely farm boy with thick glasses and zero social skills. His parents' isolation strategy had worked perhaps too well, finding solace in scientific observation. His high school teachers noted two things. First, that the boy showed an unusual capacity for independent thinking, and second, that he possessed what one instructor called a most unsettling ability to see things from another person's perspective. The family dynamics shaped him in ways that would echo through his entire career. His mother's conditional love, affection granted only when Carl met her exacting standards, became the negative template for everything he'd later advocate against. His father's scientific rigor gave him a framework for making the subjective world of emotion somehow measurable, testable, real. Meanwhile, the farm itself whispered lessons about growth and conditions. The corn didn't need to be psychoanalyzed. The cattle didn't require behavioral conditioning. They needed the right environment, and then they thrived on their own. By the time Carl left for college in 1919, he carried a strange combination of traits: rigid religious training, wrestling with scientific curiosity, social isolation, battling a deep hunger for human connection, and an intuition, still unformed, still unnamed, that human beings might contain their own wisdom about how to grow. The quiet boy from the Oak Park farm was about to discover that escaping fundamentalism would require a journey far more wrenching than any physical distance could measure. Chapter 2: The Seminary Rebel. University arrived like a window thrown open in a stuffy room. In 1919, 17-year-old Carl Rogers enrolled at the University of Wisconsin to study agriculture, a safe choice that pleased his engineering father. But college had other plans for our young farmer scientist. Within months, he'd switched his major to history, first act of rebellion, and thrown himself into campus religious activities, keeping one foot in the familiar. He joined the YMCA with the fervor of someone who'd been spiritually starved for connection. Here, finally, were people to talk to, and not just small talk, but big existential conversations about meaning and purpose. Rogers discovered he had a gift for facilitating these discussions, for creating space where others felt heard. Though if you'd told him this skill would become his life's work, he'd have laughed nervously and changed the subject. Then came 1922 and the trip that would crack his worldview wide open. Rogers was selected as one of 12 American students to attend the World Student Christian Federation Conference in Beijing, China. 6 months away from home. 6 months of exposure to Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, entire worldviews that managed to produce perfectly good people without his mother's particular brand of Christianity. The journey over was transformative in itself. Picture the earnest young Rogers on that slow boat to China, surrounded by students from different backgrounds, different beliefs, different ways of being human, and all of them somehow equally convinced of their rightness. The relativism of it all was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. In China, something fundamental shifted. Rogers saw devout Buddhists living with more compassion than many Christians he knew. He encountered Chinese students who'd never heard of Jesus but possessed wisdom that put his seminary-bound certainties to shame. The letters he sent home during those months grew increasingly troubled. What if his parents' religion wasn't the truth, but just a truth? What if there were many paths to being fully human? By the time he returned to Wisconsin, the religious foundations were crumbling. His mother's response to his doubts? Predictable devastation and a heaping serving of guilt. The breach between them would never fully heal, a personal cost Rogers would carry even as it freed him intellectually. He graduated in 1924 and, in a moment of transition confusion, or perhaps last-ditch attempt at pleasing his parents, enrolled at Union Theological Seminary in New York. The seminary was progressive by 1920 standards, but Rogers lasted exactly 2 years before the contradictions became unbearable. How could he preach certainties he no longer possessed? The seminary years weren't wasted, though. In a beautiful bit of institutional irony, Union had a cross-registration agreement with Columbia University's Teachers College right across the street. Rogers started sneaking into psychology courses, particularly those taught by William Hurd Kilpatrick, a disciple of John Dewey's progressive education movement. Here was something different. Education as growth facilitation rather than information transmission. Learning as an organic process rather than rote memorization. By 1926, Rogers had made his break. He transferred fully to Teachers College to pursue a master's in clinical psychology. The switch from theology to psychology wasn't as dramatic as it seemed. He'd simply changed his approach to the same fundamental questions. How do people change? What helps humans flourish? What conditions allow for growth? His mother stopped speaking to him for several months. His fundamentalist siblings prayed loudly for his soul at family gatherings. But Rogers, for the first time in his life, felt like he was breathing freely. The transformation was remarkable. The boy who'd arrived at college as a rigid fundamentalist left as something else entirely. A humanist psychologist in training, with a radical notion that people might know what they need better than any authority figure could tell them. Of course, he didn't yet know how to articulate this. That would require years of actually working with struggling human beings, making mistakes, and slowly, painfully learning to trust what his clients were trying to teach him. The seminary rebel was about to become a therapist. The prayers would continue, but now they'd be answered in unexpected ways, through presence, acceptance, and the revolutionary act of simply listening. Chapter 3. The Rochester Years. Learning from Children. Fresh from Columbia with a brand new PhD, 1931, dissertation on measuring personality adjustment in children, already showing his measurement obsession, Rogers faced the Great Depression's brutal job market. Academic positions were scarce. Research grants were fantasy. So he did what desperate intellectuals have always done. He took the unsexy work nobody else wanted. The Rochester Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children hired him as a psychologist. Rochester, New York, 1928. Picture: a drafty office, an overwhelming caseload, and troubled children whose problems wouldn't wait for Rogers to figure out elegant theories. This wasn't the ivory tower. This was 12 years in the trenches of real human suffering. The work was heartbreaking and mundane in equal measure. Abused children, neglected toddlers, juvenile delinquents that polite society had written off. Rogers was supposed to diagnose them, categorize them, recommend treatments. Instead, something curious happened. He started actually listening to them. The dominant approach in the 1930s was directive therapy. The expert psychologist would assess the problem, prescribe the solution, and the patient would comply. Rogers tried this. He really did. He'd conduct his careful diagnostic interviews, formulate brilliant interpretations about underlying conflicts, present his insights to patients, and watch them nod politely before completely ignoring his advice. "I was slowly learning," Rogers would later write with characteristic understatement, "that people are smarter about themselves than I was about them." The breakthrough came with a case he'd discuss for the rest of his life. A mother brought in her adolescent son for treatment. The boy was struggling behaviorally, acting out. Rogers dutifully worked with the son for months using conventional techniques. Nothing changed. Finally, as the mother was leaving one session, Rogers asked casually if she herself had any problems she wanted to discuss. The floodgates opened. For the next hour, she poured out her own pain, her marriage struggles, her fears. Rogers, exhausted from the real session with the son, mostly just listened. No interpretations, no advice, just presence. That woman returned for more sessions, did profound therapeutic work, and eventually her son's problems resolved on their own. The lesson was devastating to Rogers' professional ego and revolutionary to his understanding of therapy. Maybe the therapist's job wasn't to be clever. Maybe it was just to create conditions where the client could access their own wisdom. But Rochester gave him more than clinical insights. It gave him Otto Rank. In the early 1930s, Rank, Freud's rebellious former disciple, came to Philadelphia to teach his radical approach. Relationship therapy that focused on the here and now therapeutic relationship rather than excavating the past. Rogers attended Rank's seminars and felt something click into place. Here was someone else questioning the authoritarian therapist model. The Rochester years also brought domestic stability. Rogers had married Helen Elliott in 1924. his college sweetheart, a fellow Midwestern Protestant who'd also fled fundamentalism. They had 2 children, David and Natalie. Helen became Carl's first editor, his sounding board, his gentle critic. While he was revolutionizing therapy, she was creating the secure home base that made revolution possible. By 1940, Rogers had published his first book, The Clinical Treatment of the Problem Child, a modest, practical guide that barely hinted at the theoretical revolution brewing in his mind. But he'd learned something crucial in those 12 Rochester years, that children, when given non-judgmental attention, would often tell you exactly what was wrong and what they needed. That the presenting problem was rarely the real problem, that healing happened in the relationship, not the technique. When Ohio State University offered him a full professorship in 1940, Rogers was ready to test whether what he'd learned with troubled children in Rochester might apply more broadly, ready to write it all down systematically, ready to challenge the psychoanalytic and behaviorist orthodoxies that dominated academic psychology. The practitioner was about to become a theorist. The listening would continue, but now it would be codified, measured, taught. The quiet revolutionary was finding his voice. Chapter 4: Counseling and Psychotherapy, the book that changed everything. Ohio State, 1940. Rogers arrives as a full professor at age 38, which in the academic pecking order means he's finally allowed to have opinions. He immediately starts teaching his unorthodox approach to graduate students who've been trained in Freudian orthodoxy. The reactions range from fascinated to horrified. Picture the scene. Rogers demonstrating his technique, just listening, reflecting, refusing to interpret or direct. The students watch, waiting for the brilliant intervention that will unlock the patient's psyche. It never comes. Instead, Rogers just sits there, occasionally rephrasing what the client said, offering no advice, making no diagnoses. To traditionally trained psychologists, it looked like he was doing nothing at all. "But what do you do?" his students kept asking, exasperated. "I try to understand," Rogers would reply with that maddening calm that would become his trademark. For 2 years, he taught, practiced, and refined his thinking. Then, in 1942, he published Counseling and Psychotherapy, Newer Concepts in Practice. The book landed in academic psychology like a hand grenade wrapped in a cardigan sweater. The core argument was deceptively simple. The therapist's job is not to diagnose, interpret, or fix. It's to provide a relationship characterized by unconditional positive regard, though he didn't use that phrase yet, genuineness, and empathic understanding. In that climate of safety, people would naturally move towards psychological health, just like those potatoes on his father's farm, growing toward optimal expression when given proper conditions. Rogers did something else revolutionary. He included actual transcripts of therapy sessions in the book. Verbatim conversations, warts and all. This was scandalous. Psychoanalysts certainly never showed their work. Their case studies were carefully curated narratives that made the therapist look brilliant. Rogers showed himself fumbling, missing cues, being human. The academic psychology establishment responded with predictable horror. The psychoanalysts accused him of being superficial. Where was the deep interpretation of unconscious conflicts? The behaviorists dismissed him as unmeasurable and unscientific. Where were the controlled experiments? And everyone agreed. Calling it non-directive therapy was just a fancy way of saying doing nothing. But something curious happened. Practicing therapists, the people actually sitting with suffering humans rather than writing papers about theory, started reading the book and saying, "Yes, this matches what I've experienced. This works." The controversy made Rogers famous in academic circles, though not always in ways he enjoyed. Conferences became battlegrounds. One particularly heated 1945 symposium at the University of Minnesota saw Rogers defending his approach against a panel of hostile psychoanalysts. The audience, expecting Rogers to be eviscerated, watched in fascination as his calm, persistent questioning of assumptions slowly shifted the debate. "But how do you know the client's perception is accurate?" a critic demanded. "How do you know your interpretation is more accurate than their lived experience?" Rogers replied. Silence. The question hung in the air, unanswerable. During these Ohio State years, Rogers also began his obsession with research, not despite his humanistic approach, but because of it. If this approach worked, it should be demonstrable. He started recording therapy sessions, revolutionary in itself, and developing methods to analyze the transcripts. What were the active ingredients of therapeutic change? Could you measure empathy, quantify genuineness? His graduate students became a research army, coding thousands of therapy interactions, developing rating scales, running studies. Rogers the scientist was determined to prove Rogers the humanist wasn't just making things up. The work was exhausting. Rogers developed stress-related health issues. The irony of the man teaching others to trust their organism's wisdom while ignoring his own was not lost on Helen, who watched him work himself ragged trying to please everyone while preaching self-acceptance. By 1945, when the University of Chicago came calling with an offer to establish his own counseling center, Rogers was ready for a change, ready to build something new rather than constantly defending his ideas in hostile territory. Counseling and psychotherapy had done its work. It had announced Carl Rogers as a major voice in psychology, had drawn battle lines that would shape the field for decades, and had given thousands of therapists permission to trust their humanistic instincts rather than mechanically following psychoanalytic or behaviorist protocols. The quiet farm boy had become a revolutionary, and the revolution was just getting started. The best work, the research that would make his theories undeniable, the writing that would reach beyond academics to change culture itself, still lay ahead. Chapter 5. The Chicago Years. Creating the Research Empire. Chicago, 1945. The University of Chicago Counseling Center opens its doors with Carl Rogers as director, and immediately becomes ground zero for a research revolution. Rogers finally has what he's always wanted: resources, brilliant graduate students, and the freedom to prove that humanistic therapy isn't just warm fuzz, it's scientifically demonstrable. The center becomes a laboratory for radical transparency. Rogers installs recording equipment everywhere, shocking in the 1940s when therapists guarded their methods like trade secrets. Every therapy session recorded, every interaction coded, every outcome measured. If psychoanalysts are priests guarding mysteries in the confessional, Rogers is the scientist insisting on peer review. He recruits a team of researchers who'll become legends in their own right: Nicholas Hobbes, Thomas Gordon, Desmond Cartwright. Together, they develop the revolutionary idea that you can study psychotherapy empirically without destroying its humanity. They create rating scales for measuring empathy. Turns out you can quantify warm and genuine. They track client progress with actual outcome measures rather than therapist self-reports. The most controversial project, publishing complete therapy transcripts with detailed analysis. The 1954 book Psychotherapy and Personality Change includes the full case of Mrs. Oak, a real client, identity protected, whose entire therapeutic journey is laid bare for academic scrutiny. 40 sessions, thousands of exchanges, every fumble and breakthrough visible. The reaction from the psychotherapy establishment is predictable outrage. How dare he expose the private work of therapy? How dare he suggest that successful therapy doesn't require years of training in psychoanalytic theory? How dare he imply that warmth and acceptance might matter more than clever interpretations? But here's what Rogers discovers through all this measurement. He's right. Study after study shows that the quality of the therapeutic relationship predicts outcomes better than the therapist's theoretical orientation or years of experience. Empathy matters. Genuineness matters. Unconditional positive regard matters. The specific techniques, not so much. During these years, Rogers also refines his theory of personality. It's elegantly simple. Humans have one basic tendency: to actualize, maintain, and enhance the experiencing organism. We're all trying to become fully ourselves. The problem is that we internalize conditions of worth from others, messages that we're only acceptable if we think, feel, behave certain ways. These conditions create incongruence between our true self and our self-concept. Therapy works by providing a relationship free from conditions of worth, allowing the true self to emerge. It's basically the potato theory from his farm childhood, dressed up in academic language. The Chicago years also bring Rogers into contact with existential philosophy. He reads Kierkegaard, Buber, Tillich, and discovers they're wrestling with the same questions he is. What does it mean to be authentically human? How do we overcome alienation? What role does relationship play in becoming ourselves? The humanistic psychology movement is being born, though nobody's calling it that yet. But not everything in Chicago is triumphant research and theoretical breakthroughs. The academic politics are brutal. Rogers clashes with the university administration over his recording practices. Colleagues from other theoretical orientations wage constant low-grade warfare through committee meetings and tenure decisions. The pressure to prove himself, to justify his approach, never relents. And there's a painful irony Rogers can't ignore. He's teaching authenticity while wearing the mask of academic respectability. He's advocating for organic trust while running himself ragged, trying to meet everyone's expectations. The man preaching congruence is living with massive incongruence between his public persona and private exhaustion. In 1951, he publishes Client-Centered Therapy, his most comprehensive statement yet. The book systematically presents the theory, the research evidence, and the clinical applications. It becomes required reading in counseling programs, despite or because of its controversial premise that the client, not the therapist, is the expert on their own experience. The book also introduces his necessary and sufficient conditions for therapeutic change, a list that will be debated, refined, and tested for the next 70 years. Therapist genuineness, unconditional positive regard, empathic understanding, and client perception of these qualities. That's it. No complicated techniques required. Just be real, accepting, and truly understand. Everything else is optional. By the mid-1950s, Rogers is exhausted. The Chicago Counseling Center is thriving. His research empire is producing breakthrough after breakthrough, and he's personally heading toward burnout. The man who taught others to listen to their organism's wisdom finally hears his own body screaming, something has to change. When the University of Wisconsin offers him a joint appointment in psychology and psychiatry in 1957, Rogers sees an opportunity, a chance to prove his approach works with seriously disturbed populations, not just neurotic college students. A chance to tackle psychosis using relationship-based therapy. A chance to either vindicate his life's work or discover its limits. The scientist practitioner was about to run his riskiest experiment yet. The results would be complicated, controversial, and would nearly break him. Chapter 6. The Wisconsin Schizophrenia Project. When Theory Meets Reality. Madison, Wisconsin, 1957. Rogers returns to his alma mater as a distinguished professor with an audacious plan. Prove that client-centered therapy can help even schizophrenic patients. The psychiatric establishment considers this somewhere between naive and dangerous. Schizophrenia requires medication, hospitalization, behavioral control, not Carl Rogers' touchy-feely listening nonsense. Rogers secures a major NIMH grant and assembles a team. The Wisconsin Schizophrenia Project will be the most rigorous test yet of his theories. Hospitalized schizophrenic patients will receive intensive client-centered therapy from trained therapists. Everything will be measured: therapy relationship quality, patient symptom changes, outcomes, controls in place, proper research design. This time, the critics won't be able to dismiss the results. What could possibly go wrong? Almost everything, it turns out. The patients are far more disturbed than Rogers anticipated. Some are catatonic, others are actively hallucinating. Many have been institutionalized for years. The idea that emphatic listening alone will reach them starts looking like expensive hubris. The therapists struggle. One patient sits in complete silence for months. How do you reflect feelings to someone who won't speak? Another patient becomes violent during sessions. What happened to the safe therapeutic relationship? Therapists start suffering vicarious trauma, absorbing their patient's psychic pain without adequate support systems. Then there's the hospital environment itself, actively sabotaging the work. Psychiatric nurses, trained in behavioral control, resent these research psychologists, telling them that patients need acceptance rather than discipline. Medication protocols conflict with the therapy approach, and the institution's power hierarchy, doctors at the top, patients at the bottom, contradicts everything Rogers teaches about equality in the therapeutic relationship. Rogers himself throws himself into the clinical work, seeing patients personally, supervising therapists, trying to hold the project together through sheer force of will. The stress is immense. His perfectionism, that same drive that made his mother's conditional love so painful, now manifests in impossible standards for himself and his team. Meanwhile, the research data starts coming in. It's complicated. Some patients show remarkable improvement, others deteriorate. Overall, the results are mixed. Better than the control group on some measures, worse on others. Not the clear vindication Rogers hoped for. And then the interpersonal conflict explodes. Rogers and his co-investigator, Eugene Gendlin, clash over methodology. Team members take sides. The collaborative spirit Rogers preached evaporates into academic turf wars. Therapists burn out and quit. The project that was supposed to demonstrate the power of genuine human relationship becomes a case study in dysfunctional team dynamics. By 1963, Rogers is physically and emotionally depleted. The project stumbles to a conclusion with ambiguous results. The final research reports, published in 1967 as The Therapeutic Relationship and Its Impact, show that client-centered therapy can help some schizophrenic patients, especially when the therapist provides high levels of empathy and genuineness. But it's not the miracle cure. It's not even clearly superior to standard treatment. The critics pounce. See, Rogers' approach is fine for worried college students, but it can't handle real psychopathology. The psychoanalysts and behaviorists feel vindicated. The medications and institutionalization advocates dismiss the entire humanistic project. Rogers, for perhaps the first time in his career, faces the possibility that his life's work might be fundamentally limited. Not wrong exactly, but insufficient for the full range of human suffering. The Wisconsin years extract a brutal personal cost. Rogers' health deteriorates, stress-related conditions pile up. His marriage to Helen shows strain. She's tired of playing second fiddle to his professional mission. And at age 61, Rogers starts wondering if he has anything left to give to the field. What saves him is a characteristic move. He practices what he preaches. He actually listens to his organism's wisdom. And what it tells him is, leave academia. Get away from the research grants, the tenure politics, the need to constantly prove yourself to skeptical colleagues. Go somewhere you can just work directly with people. Teach what you know. Live more congruently. In 1963, Rogers accepts an offer from the Western Behavioral Sciences Institute in La Jolla, California. No teaching obligations, no administrative duties, just space to write, conduct workshops, and explore the applications of his approach beyond individual therapy. The move to California will transform the final phase of his career in ways he can't imagine. The man who spent his professional life in stuffy academic settings is about to discover surfing, encounter groups, and a cultural moment that's been waiting for exactly his message. The failed schizophrenia project wasn't the end of Carl Rogers' influence. It was the painful transition that freed him to become something more than an academic psychologist. The guru phase was about to begin, complete with hot tubs and human potential movement chaos. Sometimes you have to fail at what you thought was your ultimate test to discover your actual calling. Chapter 7. California Dreaming, the Encounter Group Era. La Jolla, California, 1964. Rogers, now 62 years old, arrives in Southern California and immediately realizes he's stepped into a completely different universe. Gone are the gray Wisconsin winters and staid academic departments. Here are palm trees, Pacific sunsets, and a cultural moment that's about to explode into the summer of love. The Western Behavioral Sciences Institute gives Rogers exactly what he needs: freedom. No curriculum committees, no dissertation defenses, just space to explore what happens when you apply client-centered principles beyond the one-on-one therapy room. What if you could create intensive group experiences where 10 to 15 people practiced the same unconditional positive regard, empathy, and genuineness he'd been preaching? Enter the Encounter Group. These intensive workshops, usually a weekend or week-long retreat where strangers gather to encounter each other authentically, become Rogers' new laboratory. Participants sit in circles, share feelings, confront each other, cry, hug, experience breakthrough moments of connection. It's group therapy meets consciousness raising meets whatever's in the California water supply in the 1960s. Rogers is initially cautious. He's a Midwestern scientist, not a flower child. But he discovers something powerful happening in these groups. When you remove social facades, when you create safety for people to be genuinely themselves, when you practice deep listening, transformation happens. Not always, not predictably, but often enough to be profound. The Encounter Group movement explodes. Esalen Institute up in Big Sur becomes the epicenter, hosting workshops led by Rogers, Fritz Perls, the Gestalt therapy wildman, and other pioneers of humanistic psychology. Business executives, housewives, college students, therapists, all seeking authentic human connection in an increasingly alienated society, flock to these experiences. Rogers loves it and is troubled by it in equal measure. On one hand, this is his vision realized, creating conditions for people to access their own wisdom and connect authentically. On the other hand, the encounter group scene is starting to get weird. Some facilitators abandon all structure, believing any intervention is authoritarian. Groups descend into chaos. Participants have psychological crises without adequate support. The human potential movement's shadow side emerges. And Rogers, watching trained therapists turned encounter group leaders sees his careful theories about necessary and sufficient conditions being simplified into anything goes if it's authentic. No, he wants to say. Genuineness without empathy is just rudeness. Self-expression without regard for others is narcissism dressed up as growth. But the genie is out of the bottle. By the late 1960s, encounter groups are everywhere. In corporate settings, IBM runs them for managers, educational institutions, even churches. Rogers' ideas about authentic communication and emotional honesty have gone mainstream, for better and worse. In 1968, he co-founds the Center for Studies of the Person in La Jolla with several colleagues. It's a loose collective, deliberately non-hierarchical, very 1960s, where therapists, educators, and researchers explore person-centered approaches to everything: education, conflict resolution, community building, even political change. This is also when Rogers writes Freedom to Learn, 1969, applying his therapy principles to education. The basic idea: students have a natural curiosity and desire to learn. Teachers should be facilitators, not authorities. Create the right psychological climate: empathy, genuineness, unconditional positive regard, and learning happens organically. The book resonates with progressive educators and enrages traditional academics who see education as knowledge transmission from expert to student. School boards debate whether student-centered learning is educational innovation or the collapse of standards. The culture war over education, still raging today, has Rogers' fingerprints all over it. Meanwhile, Rogers is experiencing a personal renaissance. At an age when most academics are contemplating retirement, he's having the time of his life. He learns to let his hair down, metaphorically and literally. His once neat academic appearance grows distinctly more California casual. He attends workshops as a participant, not just facilitator. He even tries psychedelics in a controlled therapeutic setting. It's the 60s after all. Helen, his wife of over 40 years, watches this transformation with mixed feelings. She's glad to see him more relaxed, more congruent. But there's also distance growing between them. Carl is increasingly surrounded by younger colleagues, engaged in intense encounter groups where emotional intimacy flows freely. She feels left behind by his metamorphosis. The Esalen years also bring Rogers into contact with counterculture figures and ideas far removed from his Protestant farm boy origins. He dialogues with Eastern spiritual teachers, reads mystical literature, explores altered states of consciousness. His thinking about the fully functioning person expands to include transcendent, even spiritual dimensions. But he never fully goes hippie. Rogers remains fundamentally a scientist, insisting on research even when studying fuzzy concepts like authenticity and peak experiences. He's the bridge between academic psychology and the human potential movement, acceptable to both, fully embraced by neither. By 1970, Rogers is an international figure. His books are translated into dozens of languages. He's invited to consult with governments, lead workshops in Europe and Asia, advise educational systems. The quiet farm boy who once struggled to make friends is now facilitating authentic connection for thousands. The California years prove that the 60-something academic could still surprise himself. That growth, that actualizing tendency he'd theorized about, didn't stop at any age. That maybe, just maybe, living congruently matters more than living conventionally. Of course, the encounter group movement would eventually crash, revealing the limits of emotional authenticity without structure or skill. But for a brief shining moment in the late 1960s, Carl Rogers' vision of human potential seemed to be transforming culture itself. The scientist had become a movement leader. The therapist had become something like a sage. And the journey was far from over. The most ambitious application of his ideas, using person-centered principles to resolve international conflicts, still lay ahead. Chapter 8. On Becoming Partners. The Marriage Book Nobody Expected. 1972. Carl Rogers, now 70 years old and famous for his work on therapy and education, publishes something unexpected, a book about marriage. Becoming Partners, Marriage and Its Alternatives lands in the middle of America's sexual revolution, women's liberation movement, and rapidly rising divorce rates. The timing couldn't be more perfect, or more ironic. Because here's what almost nobody knows: Rogers' own marriage is quietly struggling. Helen Elliott Rogers, his partner of 48 years, has watched her husband's transformation from buttoned-up academic to California encounter group facilitator with growing unease. The man who preaches authenticity and emotional openness has, for decades, maintained a very traditional, very boundaried marriage. They're affectionate, certainly, respectful, absolutely, but deeply intimate in the way Rogers advocates in his therapeutic work. That's more complicated. The book itself is fascinating. Rogers interviews couples in various arrangements: traditional marriages, open relationships, living together unmarried, scandalous in 1972, exploring what makes partnerships thrive or fail. His conclusion, unsurprisingly, mirrors his therapy theory. Relationships succeed when both partners can be genuine, offer each other unconditional positive regard, and practice empathic understanding. He writes about commitment as a choice continually renewed, not a legal obligation. About communication as the foundation of intimacy. About the need for both partners to keep growing as individuals, even within partnership. Progressive stuff for the early 70s, and deeply threatening to conservatives who see it as another assault on traditional family values. What Rogers doesn't write about explicitly, but what anyone reading carefully can sense between the lines, is his own struggle. How do you maintain a marriage formed in 1924 when you were both fundamentalist farm kids, while you've personally evolved into someone who facilitates nude encounter groups at Esalen? Yes, that happened. The 1960s were wild. Helen, ever the private person, must have felt increasingly exposed. Her husband is famous for vulnerability and authenticity, which means aspects of their relationship inevitably become material for his work. The encounter groups he facilitates encourage intense emotional intimacy, sometimes blurring into romantic or sexual feelings that participants must work through in the group setting. There are rumors, never confirmed, always whispered, about Rogers having deep emotional connections with colleagues and workshop participants. Not affairs necessarily, but the kind of profound intimacy that can feel threatening to a spouse. Whether anything crossed lines is less important than the fact that Rogers' work required constant boundary navigation in an era when boundaries themselves were being questioned. And here's the painful paradox. Rogers advocates for complete honesty in relationships. But complete honesty about feeling emotionally connected to someone other than your spouse, that's where theory meets the messiness of actual human relationships. The book is well received. Couples therapists adopt it as a text. Progressive readers find validation for their non-traditional arrangements. And Rogers gets invited to lead more couples workshops, more marriage encounter groups, more consultations about relationship difficulties. Meanwhile, back home in Loyola, Helen is increasingly dealing with health issues. The woman who created the stable home base that allowed Rogers' career to flourish is now needing care herself. And Rogers, so gifted at being present with clients and workshop participants, must figure out how to apply his own principles to the most intimate relationship of his life. They do something brave in the mid-1970s. They attend therapy together. Rogers, the famous therapist, becomes a client working on his marriage with Helen. It's humbling and necessary. They discover what many couples learn. Knowing the theory of good relationships doesn't automatically translate to living it, especially when decades of patterns are already established. What emerges from this period is a deeper, more authentic partnership. Rogers later writes about these years with unusual personal disclosure, acknowledging that becoming genuinely open with Helen required unlearning decades of emotional caution. That unconditional positive regard is harder with your spouse than with clients, because spouses actually have conditions and expectations and shared histories that complicate acceptance. The marriage book becomes Rogers' unexpected bestseller outside academic circles. Regular people, not just therapists, read it and recognize their own relationship struggles. The letters pour in, couples thanking him for permission to be honest with each other, divorcees grateful someone validated that leaving wasn't failure, young people appreciating alternatives to their parents' unhappy marriages. But the conservative backlash is fierce. Religious leaders denounce Rogers for undermining the sanctity of marriage. Traditional therapists accuse him of being too permissive, failing to uphold family stability. One critic memorably writes that Rogers has done for marriage what he did for therapy, removed all authority and structure, leaving only chaos dressed up as freedom. Rogers, ever the gentle revolutionary, responds by simply continuing to model what he teaches. He speaks openly about his marriage struggles. He admits that staying together isn't always the healthiest choice. He refuses to prescribe universal rules, instead insisting that each partnership must find its own path. Through it all, Helen remains his anchor. She's less interested in fame than Carl, more private, more traditionally Midwestern. But she's also the person who knows him most completely, knows the gap between his public persona and private doubts, knows the frightened fundamentalist farm boy still living somewhere inside the famous psychologist. When people ask Rogers the secret to a long marriage, his answer evolves over these years. Early on, he might have said something general about communication and respect. After the work with Helen, after the honesty and the therapy, and the real effort to live congruently in his most important relationship, he says something more humble. Keep choosing each other. Keep being willing to be known. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll grow in the same direction. The marriage book turns out to be more than just another application of person-centered theory. It's Rogers' wrestling match with his own congruence, trying to close the gap between the relationships he helps others build and the one he's actually living. And in that struggle, he becomes more human, more real, more genuinely helpful than all his earlier academic brilliance. Sometimes the greatest teaching comes not from getting it right, but from showing the work of trying. The couple's therapist had become a couple in therapy. The paradoxes would continue, but now they were acknowledged, embraced, integrated into a more honest understanding of what it means to be human and to love another human across a lifetime of change. Chapter 9: The International Peacemaker, Taking Empathy to War Zones. By the late 1970s, Rogers has an outrageous idea. What if you could apply person-centered principles to international conflict? Not therapy for individuals, not encounter groups for volunteers, but actual peace negotiations between warring factions, hostile nations, groups that literally want to kill each other. His colleagues think he's lost his mind. You can't just listen empathetically at people shooting at each other and expect peace to break out. International relations requires sophisticated diplomacy, power negotiations, strategic thinking, not Carl Rogers sitting in a circle asking, "How did that make you feel?" Rogers, now in his late 70s, doesn't care what the skeptics think. He's spent decades proving people wrong, and he's got nothing to lose except his reputation, which, let's be honest, already makes half of psychology uncomfortable. So he starts organizing peace workshops. The first major experiment, Northern Ireland, 1974. Catholics and Protestants who've been killing each other for generations agree, with immense difficulty, to spend several days together in intensive encounter-style dialogue. Rogers and his colleagues facilitate, creating the psychological safety for people to speak their truth, to be heard, to recognize humanity in their enemies. It's simultaneously inspiring and heartbreaking. Participants have breakthrough moments. A Protestant woman realizing the Catholic man across from her loves his children exactly as she loves hers. A Catholic man hearing the genuine fear in a Protestant voice and recognizing it mirrors his own. Tears, apologies, glimpses of mutual understanding. And then they go home to Belfast, where the bombs still explode and the tribal identities remain entrenched. The workshops don't end the troubles. They can't. Individual human connection, however profound, can't easily overcome centuries of structural violence and political complexity. But something shifts in the participants. Many stay in contact, become advocates for peace, work in their communities for reconciliation. They've experienced something rare, seeing the enemy as fully human. It doesn't fix everything, but it's not nothing. Emboldened, Rogers aims bigger. In 1985, at age 83, yes, 83, he facilitates a US-Soviet dialogue in Austria. This is peak Cold War. Reagan calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. Nuclear tensions at terrifying heights. Mutual suspicion so thick you could cut it with a missile. Rogers brings together 50 participants, American and Soviet citizens, diplomats, peace activists, ordinary people. Over several intense days, they practice what Rogers has been preaching, speaking authentically about fears and hopes, listening without judgment, recognizing shared humanity beneath ideological differences. A Soviet participant breaks down describing the loss of 20 million Soviet lives in World War II and the terror of another invasion from the West. An American veteran shares his terror of nuclear annihilation and his inability to see Russians as anything but threats. Rogers, facilitating, simply holds space, reflecting feelings, encouraging deeper sharing, trusting the process. Does this workshop end the Cold War? Of course not. The wall falls for complicated political and economic reasons having nothing to do with encounter groups. But decades later, participants talk about that Austria meeting as transformative, a moment when the abstract enemy became concrete individuals with children and fears and dreams not so different from their own. Rogers also facilitates workshops in South Africa during apartheid, in Central America during civil wars between Israelis and Palestinians. Each time, the pattern repeats. Initial hostility and suspicion, gradual softening as people share stories, moments of genuine connection that transcend political positions, and then the brutal reality check when participants return to societies where those connections are structurally impossible to maintain. The critics have a field day. Rogers thinks he can hug away genocide. Person-centered therapy for international conflict is like bringing a therapist's couch to a knife fight. The political scientists especially dismiss this as naive humanism, ignoring power dynamics, economic interests, historical grievances that no amount of empathic listening can resolve. And they're partly right. Rogers is sometimes naive about structural violence, about how economic systems and power inequalities perpetuate conflict regardless of individual goodwill. His faith in human nature, that if you just create the right conditions, people will choose connection over violence, doesn't account for situations where violence is rational self-interest or where systems reward conflict. But Rogers is also onto something. The research on peace building that emerges in subsequent decades validates much of his intuition. That sustainable peace requires not just political agreements, but transformed relationships. That dehumanization is the root of atrocity. That creating spaces for genuine encounter between enemies is necessary, if not sufficient, for reconciliation. His most profound insight might be this: you can't negotiate peace between abstract entities called sides. Peace happens between humans who've chosen to see each other. The politics still matter. The economics still matter. But without the human recognition Rogers facilitates, political agreements remain fragile. The personal cost of this work is enormous. Rogers is traveling constantly in his 80s, living in hotel rooms, facilitating emotionally intense workshops that drain even young therapists. Helen, his anchor for 60 years, is seriously ill. He's torn between his global peace mission and his dying wife, the ultimate incongruence between public calling and private responsibility. In 1979, Helen dies. Rogers is devastated in ways he rarely allows the public to see. For all their struggles, she was his partner, his first editor, his connection to the farm boy he'd been before fame and encounter groups and international peace work. Her death leaves him unmoored. But in characteristic Rogers fashion, he grieves by working harder. The peace workshops intensify. He writes A Way of Being, 1980, his most philosophical and personal book, exploring questions of consciousness, spirituality, and human potential. He's racing his own mortality, trying to get everything out before it's too late. When people ask the octogenarian Rogers why he keeps flying to conflict zones when he could comfortably retire, his answer is simple. Because I can. Because someone should. Because if we don't try to recognize each other's humanity, what hope is there? The international work never achieves the concrete measurable success his research-oriented mind craves. You can't prove you prevented a war. You can't quantify transformed relationships. But Rogers trusts the process, his ultimate act of faith in the approach he spent a lifetime developing. The therapist had become a peace activist. The scientist had become something like a prophet, and the work of simply listening, simply creating space for human connection, had scaled from the consulting room to the global stage. Whether it was enough, whether empathy could really shift intractable conflicts, remains an open question. But Rogers died trying. And that, perhaps, was its own form of congruence. Chapter 10. A Way of Being. The Philosopher Emerges. The 1980s find Rogers in a strange position. He's simultaneously an elder statesman of psychology and a marginalized figure increasingly dismissed by the cognitive behavioral revolution sweeping the field. While he's facilitating international peace workshops, back in the ivory towers, a new generation of psychologists is all about measurable techniques, diagnosis-specific protocols, and brain chemistry. Rogers' response? He goes deeper into philosophy. A Way of Being, 1980, is unlike anything he's written before. Yes, there's research and case studies. He's still a scientist. But there's also poetry, personal reflection, and something approaching mysticism. The farm boy from fundamentalist Oak Park is now writing about transcendent experiences, altered states of consciousness, and what he calls the quiet revolution in human relationships. The book's central sections read like wisdom literature from someone who's earned the right to wisdom through decades of actually sitting with suffering humans. Rogers writes about presence, not the technique of being present, but the ontological state of existing fully in relationship. About the formative tendency in the universe, His speculation that the actualizing tendency he observed in humans might be part of a larger cosmic process toward complexity and consciousness. His critics call it New Age woo. His defenders call it holistic integration of science and spirituality. Rogers himself seems unconcerned with either camp. At 78, he's finally free to think out loud without worrying about tenure committees. The philosophical turn isn't really new. It's Rogers finally saying publicly what he's intuited for decades, that the therapeutic relationship is fundamentally mysterious, that healing happens in spaces his research methods can measure but never fully explain, that rationality, while valuable, isn't the only or even primary way humans understand truth. He starts corresponding with physicists about quantum mechanics and consciousness, very 80s. He dialogues with Buddhist teachers about mindfulness and presence, decades before mindfulness becomes mainstream. He writes about dying and transcendence with the urgency of someone running out of time. Because he is running out of time. Rogers is increasingly frail, dealing with the accumulated health issues of 8 decades of intensive living. But his mind remains sharp, still curious, still questioning his own assumptions. In 1985, he's nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for his conflict resolution work. He doesn't win, Mikhail Gorbachev gets it instead. But the nomination itself signals how far the farm boy therapist has traveled. From fundamentalist childhood to Nobel consideration, it's a long, strange journey. During these final years, Rogers also confronts his legacy. What will happen to person-centered therapy after he's gone? Will it be watered down into techniques, rigidified into orthodoxy, or worse, forgotten entirely as psychology chases the latest neuroscience findings? He sees the field splitting. Some followers become fundamentalists of their own, insisting that Rogers' approach is the only valid therapy and dismissing all others. The irony, creating a new orthodoxy from Rogers' anti-authoritarian approach, is painful. Others integrate person-centered principles into eclectic practice, taking what's useful and leaving the rest. Rogers prefers the integrators. He's always been more interested in what works than in being right. If future therapists blend his emphasis on relationship with cognitive behavioral techniques or psychodynamic insights, that's fine. The important thing is the client's growth, not the purity of the approach. He also watches the encounter group movement implode. By the mid-1980s, encounter groups have been thoroughly discredited. Too many psychological casualties from unqualified facilitators. Too many cults masquerading as growth workshops. Too much chaos without structure. The human potential movement's shadow side has emerged fully. Rogers feels both vindicated and sad. Vindicated because he always warned that genuineness without empathy and skill was dangerous. Sad because something valuable, the possibility of authentic community, transformative human encounter, has been tainted by the excesses. In interviews during these final years, Rogers is asked repeatedly, "What matters most? What would you want people to remember?" His answer evolves, but the core stays consistent. That people have wisdom about themselves, that they can be trusted, that if you create the right conditions, safety, empathy, genuineness, they'll move toward health and growth. And that the most radical thing you can do is actually listen to another human being. Simple, almost simplistic, and yet, in a world of increasing polarization, algorithmic manipulation, and attention capitalism, more radical than ever. Rogers also wrestles with his own actualizing. How does he want to spend his final years? More writing, more workshops, or simply being, practicing the congruence he's preached? He chooses a mix. He continues facilitating groups when his health permits. He writes essays for journals. But he also allows himself to simply be, spending time with family. His children, David and Natalie, now adults with their own lives, walking on the beach, sitting in silence. The man who spent decades creating conditions for others' growth is finally trusting his own organism's wisdom about what he needs. The meta level is not lost on him. He's become his own client, listening to himself with the same empathy he extended to others. In 1986, he's awarded the American Psychological Association's Award for Distinguished Professional Contributions. The acceptance speech, delivered by video because he's too frail to travel, is vintage Rogers. Humble, personal, grateful, and still questioning. "Have I made a difference?" he asks. "I hope so, but more important, have I been genuine in the trying?" The philosopher, therapist, peacemaker is preparing to die. Not morbidly, but realistically. He's lived a full life, from fundamentalist farm to international peace work, from complete conformity to radical authenticity. The actualizing tendency he described theoretically, he's embodied personally. And perhaps that's the greatest teaching, not his books or research or techniques, but the visible arc of a life spent becoming more fully himself. From the frightened boy scared of his mother's conditional love, to the elder statesman trusting that human growth is possible even in the darkest circumstances. The way of being he wrote about wasn't just philosophy, it was autobiography. Chapter 11. The Final Year. Becoming Fully Himself. January 1987. Carl Rogers, now 85 years old, knows he's dying. The body that carried him from Oak Park Farm to international peace workshops is finally giving out. But the mind, that curious, questing, ever-questioning mind, remains sharp. He spent the past year in a kind of retrospective mood, reviewing his life's work, making peace with both his successes and failures. The Wisconsin Schizophrenia project that didn't produce clear results, he can finally admit it taught him humility. The encounter groups that sometimes caused psychological harm, he acknowledges the movement outran the careful research base he tried to establish. But mostly, Rogers is at peace. He's lived congruently. Maybe not perfectly, who does, but increasingly so. The gap between his inner experience and outer expression has narrowed over the decades. The frightened fundamentalist boy who learned to hide his feelings became the elderly psychologist who could sit with presidents, facilitate peace talks, and still admit uncertainty. In February, he gives his final public presentation at the American Psychological Association's Evolution of Psychotherapy conference in Phoenix. His colleagues want to honor him, But Rogers refuses to just accept accolades. Instead, he facilitates one more demonstration, showing younger therapists what person-centered therapy looks like in practice. Watching video of that final demonstration is poignant. Rogers is visibly frail, his movements slower, his voice softer. But when the client begins speaking, something magical happens. Rogers leans forward, his entire being focused on the person before him. The famous technique, empathic reflection, isn't technique at all. It's the natural expression of someone who genuinely wants to understand. After the demonstration, a young therapist asks, "Dr. Rogers, after all these years, what have you learnt about people?" Rogers pauses for a long moment. Then, that they're stronger than they think, wiser than they know, and that they blossom in the warmth of genuine acceptance, like plants in good soil. He's come full circle, back to the farm, back to the potatoes growing toward light, back to the fundamental insight that launched his career. Given proper conditions, organisms naturally move toward their fullest expression. In March, Rogers falls at home and breaks his hip. The injury isn't fatal, but at 85, complications are inevitable. He's hospitalized in La Jolla and his family gathers. David and Natalie keep vigil, joined by colleagues and friends from decades of work. Even in the hospital, Rogers remains himself. He asks about the nurses' lives, listens to doctors describe his condition, maintains his curiosity about the experience of dying. "I'm fascinated," he tells one visitor, "by this process. I wish I could research it." The end, when it comes, is relatively peaceful. On February 4, 1987, Carl Rogers dies of cardiac arrest following hip surgery. He's surrounded by family. His last coherent words, according to those present, are, "I love you." Fitting, really, for a man whose life's work centered on love, not romantic love, but the agape love of unconditional positive regard. Those final words encapsulate everything. The obituaries in major newspapers are respectful but somewhat puzzled. The New York Times calls him a pioneer of humanistic psychology, but struggles to explain his impact to lay readers. How do you summarize a career that spanned individual therapy, group work, education reform, and international peace-building? How do you measure the influence of someone whose main contribution was reminding people to listen to each other? Within psychology, the reactions are mixed. Cognitive behaviorists, now dominating the field, offer polite condolences while privately dismissing Rogers as a relic of softer, less scientific times. Psychoanalysts, never fans, barely acknowledge his passing. But practicing therapists, the people actually sitting with clients daily, mourn deeply. Whatever their theoretical orientation, most incorporate Rogerian principles, building strong therapeutic alliances, practicing empathy, seeing clients as collaborators rather than patients. The memorial service in La Jolla is attended by hundreds. Colleagues share stories. Rogers falling asleep in boring faculty meetings, but coming alive in clinical demonstrations. His tendency to eat the same lunch every day, creature of habit, while being completely open to new ideas, creature of curiosity. The way he could sit with someone in excruciating emotional pain without flinching or trying to fix it. Eugene Gendlin, despite their conflicts during the Wisconsin years, delivers a eulogy that captures something essential. Carl believed in people, not as abstract humanity, but as specific, concrete individuals. He believed in their capacity for growth, especially when they couldn't believe in themselves. Several clients speak anonymously, describing how Rogers's approach had been life-changing. One woman shares that Rogers never told her what to do, never judged her choices, just listened until she could hear herself think. "He gave me permission," she says, "to be myself," which sounds simple until you realize how rare that is. The International Peacework colleagues talk about Rogers's courage in bringing therapeutic principles to conflict zones. His stubborn insistence that empathy wasn't weakness but strength. His willingness to sit with Soviets, South Africans, Irish Catholics and Protestants, Israelis and Palestinians, creating space for human recognition in the midst of violent hatred. After the memorial, as colleagues gather for the inevitable wake, conversations turn to legacy. What will endure from Rogers' work? The techniques, already being absorbed into eclectic therapy. The research, still cited but increasingly seen as foundational rather than cutting edge. The philosophy, perhaps his most lasting contribution. Some worry that person-centered therapy will fade as the field chases neuroscience and evidence-based protocols. Others argue that Rogers' core insights, the importance of therapeutic relationship, the client's role as expert on their own experience, have become so integrated into therapy that we don't even recognize them as Rogerian anymore. The debate continues through the evening, which would have amused Rogers. He spent his life questioning certainties, so having his own legacy remain uncertain seems fitting. Back at the Center for Studies of the Person, Rogers' office remains untouched for weeks. His desk, usually cluttered with manuscripts and journal articles, holds his final project, notes for a book on aging and dying, filled with his characteristic blend of research citations and personal reflection. The project will never be completed, but the notes reveal a man fascinated by his own ending, seeing it as one more opportunity for growth. In the drawer, someone finds a journal entry from the week before his fall. "I've lived fully, made mistakes, learned from most of them, loved deeply if imperfectly, tried to trust the process. I'm curious about what comes next, even if next is simply ceasing to be. The actualizing tendency doesn't stop at death, it just changes form. Everything returns to the soil eventually and nourishes new growth." The farm boy, at the end, was still thinking about growth, still trusting the process, still curious about the next chapter, even if he wouldn't be around to read it. Carl Rogers had become fully himself, which was, after all, the only thing he ever really asked of anyone. Chapter 12. The Rogerian Revolution: How Listening Changed Therapy. In the years immediately following Rogers' death, something curious happens. His influence becomes both more and less visible. Person-centered therapy as a specific modality starts to fade from psychology training programs, replaced by cognitive behavioral, dialectical behavioral, and other evidence-based treatments. But Rogerian principles infect everything, becoming so fundamental to good therapy that they're barely recognized as Rogerian anymore. In the 1950s, when Rogers first proposed that the therapeutic relationship mattered more than specific techniques, this was heretical. Psychoanalysts believed interpretation unlocked the unconscious. Behaviorists believed conditioning changed behavior. The idea that simply being empathic, genuine, and accepting could facilitate change seemed laughably simplistic. By the 1990s, research has definitively shown that therapeutic alliance, the quality of the relationship between therapist and client, is one of the strongest predictors of treatment outcome, regardless of therapeutic approach. Rogers was right. The relationship is the intervention. But because these ideas have become mainstream, they're no longer credited to Rogers. Modern therapists practice empathic listening, unconditional positive regard, and genuineness without realizing they're being Rogerian. It's like asking fish about water, so ubiquitous it's invisible. The research legacy is similarly paradoxical. Rogers pioneered recording therapy sessions, studying transcripts, measuring relationship variables, all revolutionary in the 1940s and 50s. But his humanistic orientation made him uncomfortable with the reductionism required for modern evidence-based practice. You can't package unconditional positive regard into a treatment manual. You can't manualize therapeutic presence. So, in an era obsessed with empirically supported treatments, Rogers gets filed under historically important but not evidence-based. Never mind that his research methodology created the foundation for therapy process research. Never mind that outcome studies consistently show person-centered therapy works as well as other approaches for many conditions. The field has moved towards specificity, diagnosis-specific protocols, session-by-session manuals, while Rogers' approach is fundamentally holistic. The biggest impact, ironically, might be outside traditional therapy. Corporate coaching borrows heavily from person-centered principles, though they'd never admit it. Leadership presence is just therapeutic presence rebranded for business. Educational reform movements, student-centered learning, project-based education are all Rogers' ideas applied to classrooms. Conflict resolution and restorative justice practices use Rogerian dialogue techniques. Even pop culture absorbs Rogers' influence. The rise of active listening as a relationship skill. The emphasis on validating feelings in parenting books. The whole therapy speak culture of naming emotions and seeking understanding. These trace back to Rogers' insistence that being heard is fundamentally healing. Of course, there's also Rogers' shadow. The encounter group movement's excesses taught hard lessons about what happens when empathy and authenticity are emphasized without adequate structure or ethical boundaries. The human potential movement's individualism sometimes veered into narcissism dressed as self-actualization. And Rogers' optimism about human nature doesn't always account for systemic oppression, trauma's long-term impacts, or the reality that some people need more than acceptance to heal. The harshest critiques come from those addressing power and oppression. Feminist therapists note that Rogers' emphasis on individual growth doesn't adequately address how patriarchy shapes women's sense of self. Critical race scholars point out that unconditional positive regard from a white therapist toward a black client without acknowledgement of racism's impacts can be its own form of violence. LGBTQ+ advocates appreciate Rogers' acceptance, but note he wrote little about sexuality and identity. These critiques are fair. Rogers, for all his radicalism, was still a straight, white, Midwestern man born in 1902. His blind spots were real. But his core insight that people contain their own wisdom and need conditions for its emergence remains valuable, even when expanded to include analysis of oppressive structures. Perhaps the most important Rogerian legacy is methodological. He proved you could study the subjective world scientifically, that empathy, genuineness, and unconditional positive regard could be operationalized, measured, and taught. This opened space for entire branches of research on therapeutic process, emotional intelligence, mindfulness, and positive psychology. Without Rogers, we probably wouldn't have the current research on compassion, gratitude, or post-traumatic growth. His insistence that psychology should study health and growth, not just pathology, created permission for examining human strengths and potential. The person-centered therapy institutes that carry on his work are small, scattered, struggling for relevance in an era of insurance-dictated brief therapy and diagnosis-driven treatment. But they persist, training new therapists in the principles Rogers articulated, keeping alive the radical notion that people don't need to be fixed, they need to be met. Meanwhile, Rogers' books continue selling steadily. On Becoming a Person remains in print 60 years after publication. Beloved by therapists in training, sensitive college students, and anyone seeking permission to be authentically themselves. The testimonials on Amazon are touching. This book changed my life. I finally felt understood. Rogers gave me permission to trust myself. Which is perhaps the ultimate measure of his influence, not in citation counts or treatment protocols, but in individuals who encountered his ideas and felt seen, validated, encouraged to become more fully themselves. The revolution he started wasn't about overthrowing therapeutic orthodoxies, though he did that. It was about returning authority to the person seeking help, about trusting that the client knows at some level what they need, about the therapist stepping off the expert pedestal and into genuine relationship. In our current era of AI therapists, app-based mental health care, and 5-minute medication management, Rogers' emphasis on human presence and authentic relationship seems either hopelessly outdated or radically essential, depending on your perspective. The farm boy who watched potatoes grow without force changed therapy by insisting it honor the same organic process in humans. Whether we remember his name or not, we're all practicing in the world he helped create, one where being heard, accepted, and understood is recognized as fundamentally therapeutic. The revolution was quiet, but it was real, and it's not over yet. Chapter 13. Rogers in the digital age, when algorithms try to listen. If Carl Rogers were alive today, walking into a modern therapy practice, he'd encounter a landscape both familiar and alien. Therapists still sit with clients, still practice empathy, still build relationships. But now there's electronic health records requiring diagnosis codes within the first session. Insurance companies demanding treatment plans after 2 meetings. Apps promising therapy through chatbots that simulate empathic listening. And perhaps most disturbingly, AI large language models being trained to provide person-centered responses. The irony is exquisite. Rogers spent his career arguing that genuine human presence can't be reduced to technique. And now Silicon Valley is trying to automate exactly that. Coding empathy into algorithms, programming unconditional positive regard into chatbots. Some of these AI therapy tools explicitly claim Rogerian inspiration. They're designed to reflect feelings, ask open-ended questions, provide non-judgmental responses. And in limited ways they work. Users report feeling heard by these programs. The AI never gets tired, never judges, is available 24/7, and costs less than human therapists. Rogers would be simultaneously fascinated and horrified. Fascinated because it's an empirical test of his theories. If therapeutic relationship is what matters, can a sophisticated enough simulation provide it? Horrified because the whole premise misses something essential. That healing happens in authentic human encounter, not performative empathy. The modern mental health crisis makes these questions urgent. Therapist shortages, insurance barriers, stigma, cost, all create massive treatment gaps. If AI chatbots can provide even 60% of what human therapy offers, maybe that's better than nothing? Maybe Rogers' principles, even imperfectly instantiated in code, can scale help to millions who'd never access traditional therapy? But here's what gets lost in automation. Rogers' approach wasn't about saying the right words. It was about being a certain way, genuinely present, authentically engaged, willing to be changed by the encounter. Can an AI be changed by meeting you? Can it genuinely care about your growth? These aren't just philosophical quibbles, they're questions about whether the active ingredient in Rogerian therapy can exist outside human relationship. The digital age also amplifies Rogers' concerns about conditional worth. Social media is essentially a machine for creating conditional worth. You're acceptable if you get likes, shares, followers. The algorithmic feedback loops shape identity in exactly the way Rogers warned against, conforming to external approval rather than trusting internal experience. Modern therapy apps sometimes try to counter this with Rogerian principles, encouraging self-acceptance, validating all emotions, promoting authenticity. But they deliver this via platforms designed to addict, surveil, and monetize users' psychological vulnerabilities. It's unconditional positive regard sponsored by companies that profit from your insecurity. The contradictions are dizzying. There's also the question of what Rogers would think about modern diagnostic culture. The DSM-5 has 300+ diagnostic categories. Insurance requires diagnosis for reimbursement. Clients often come to therapy wanting to know what's wrong with me and leave with labels: depression, anxiety, ADHD, autism, borderline personality disorder. Rogers rejected diagnostic labeling, arguing it put the therapist in expert role and the client in patient role, undermining the collaborative relationship he saw as essential. But modern understanding of neurodiversity, trauma, and mental health conditions suggests some labeling is helpful. Knowing you have ADHD or PTSD can be validating, explanatory, community building. The synthesis might be Rogerian. Let clients choose their relationship with diagnostic labels. Some find them liberating, others find them limiting. The therapist's job isn't to impose categories, but to help clients make meaning of their experience, whatever language serves them best. Online therapy platforms raise interesting questions about Rogers' emphasis on presence. Can you be genuinely present via video call, text-based therapy, voice notes? Rogers did all his work face-to-face, believing physical presence mattered. But research on telehealth therapy suggests the medium matters less than the quality of attention. Maybe presence transcends physical proximity. It's about full attention, wherever bodies happen to be. The pandemic forced this experiment globally. Millions experienced therapy via Zoom for the first time. And guess what? Rogerian principles translated. Empathy works through screens. Unconditional positive regard transmits via pixels. Genuineness comes through even with slightly laggy audio. Perhaps Rogers would appreciate this. His approach scaled precisely because it's not technique-dependent. You don't need specific equipment or settings. Just two humans paying attention, being real with each other. That can happen in a consulting room, a video call, even, carefully, via text. The digital age also enables something Rogers would love: radical transparency. His revolutionary practice of recording therapy sessions and publishing transcripts is now standard. Training videos, demonstrated sessions, real-time supervision via video, all normal. The mystification of therapy that Rogers fought against is increasingly impossible when everything can be recorded, shared, studied. But transparency has shadows. The same technology that enables learning enables surveillance. Therapists worry about notes being subpoenaed, recordings hacked, session data mined for AI training. The safety Rogers saw as essential for client vulnerability is harder to guarantee when everything digital is potentially public. Social justice movements have also complicated Rogers' legacy in productive ways. His emphasis on empathy and understanding is necessary but not sufficient for addressing systemic oppression. A therapist can unconditionally positively regard a black client all day, but if they don't understand racism's impacts, the therapy remains limited. Modern Rogerian therapists integrate his principles with awareness of power, privilege, and oppression. They might practice cultural humility. Rogers' empathic understanding extended to recognizing what they don't know about clients' lived experience. They create space for clients to name and process systemic barriers, not just internal conflicts. This evolution is very Rogerian. He always said his theories should develop through experience. that therapists should learn from clients rather than imposing pre-existing frameworks. Applying that principle means letting marginalized clients teach about oppression's psychological impacts, then integrating those insights into practice. The question for the 21st century might be, can Rogers' optimism about human nature survive contact with algorithmic manipulation, attention capitalism, and social media-induced mental health crises? When people's sense of self is literally shaped by engagement metrics, when parasocial relationships replace real ones, when AI can simulate empathy, what happens to the actualizing tendency? Rogers would probably argue the actualizing tendency persists but requires more intentional cultivation. That creating conditions for authentic self-expression is harder in an environment designed to commodify identity. That genuine human encounter is more precious, not less, when algorithmic interactions become default. He might see the current mental health crisis, rising anxiety, depression, loneliness, as confirmation of his theories. When people lack genuine acceptance, empathic understanding, and space to be authentic, they suffer. The solution isn't better medication or more apps. It's more human connection of the type Rogers practiced and taught. Of course, that connection is exactly what capitalism has trouble monetizing and insurance companies won't adequately reimburse. Which brings us back to the fundamental tension. Rogers' approach requires time, presence, relationship, all increasingly expensive luxuries in our efficiency-obsessed healthcare system. The future of Rogerian therapy might not be in traditional clinical practice at all. It might be in peer support groups, mutual aid networks, community spaces where people practice presence with each other outside professional contexts. Rogers always said his principles weren't just for therapists, they were for all human relationships. Maybe the digital age's great irony is that it makes us hunger for exactly what Rogers offered, to be genuinely seen, heard, accepted, to encounter another human being without performance or pretense, to trust that we contain our own wisdom about how to grow. The algorithms can simulate empathy, but they can't be changed by meeting you. They can't genuinely care whether you flourish. They can't offer the transformative recognition of one consciousness meeting another with full presence. And in that limitation lies both the enduring relevance of Rogers' work and the challenge for future generations. How do we preserve space for genuine human encounter in an increasingly mediated world? How do we practice unconditional positive regard when everything is conditional, contingent on metrics, engagement, monetization? Rogers wouldn't have answers, but he'd sit with the questions, listen deeply, and trust that collectively we contain wisdom about what we need to thrive. The farm boy who watched potatoes grow would remind us, organisms actualize given proper conditions. Our job is creating and protecting those conditions, especially in environments designed to prevent them. Chapter 14. The Critics and the Controversies. What Rogers Got Wrong. For all his influence and insight, Carl Rogers wasn't infallible. It's time to examine where his theories hit limits, where his optimism became naivete, and where his blind spots created real problems. First, the optimism issue. Rogers' fundamental premise that humans have an inherent actualizing tendency towards health and growth is beautiful. It's also not universally true, or at least not universally accessible. Some people are so damaged by trauma that their survival mechanisms actively prevent growth. Some psychological conditions involve brain chemistry or structure that no amount of empathic listening can fix. Some people need medication, structure, or directive intervention before they can access their inner wisdom. Rogers acknowledged this peripherally, but never integrated it fully. His work with schizophrenic patients in Wisconsin showed the limits, but he never quite admitted that person-centered therapy alone isn't sufficient for severe mental illness. The field moved on to integrated treatments, medication plus therapy, DBT's blend of acceptance and change strategies, while Rogers kept insisting relationship was enough. It wasn't. Then there's the power blindness. Rogers wrote as if therapist and client could meet as equals in some neutral space where only individual psychology mattered. He rarely addressed how race, class, gender, sexuality, and disability shape both the therapeutic relationship and client's sense of self. His unconditional positive regard assumed the therapist's regard carried equal weight for all clients, ignoring that regard from a white male therapist lands differently for women, people of color, or LGBTQ clients navigating systemic oppression. Feminist critics pointed this out for decades. When Rogers advised women to trust their organistic experiencing, he didn't account for how patriarchy shapes women's internal experience, making them doubt their own perceptions, prioritize others' needs, internalize misogyny. You can't just empathetically listen someone out of socialized gender roles. Similarly, Rogers' emphasis on individual autonomy and self-direction reflects Western, particularly American values. His approach assumes the individual is the primary unit of meaning and health. But in collectivist cultures, the family or community matters more than individual authenticity. A person from a traditional Chinese or indigenous culture might find Rogers' self-focus alienating rather than liberating. The encounter group debacle reveals another limitation. Rogers underestimated how his approach could be misused. His belief that people would naturally regulate themselves in groups, that facilitators just needed to trust the process, this led to real harm. Unqualified leaders ran groups that re-traumatized participants. The emphasis on emotional catharsis over integration left people raw without resources to heal. Some encounter groups devolved into emotional bullying masked as authenticity. Rogers condemned the worst abuses, but never fully grappled with how his theoretical framework made them possible. If you emphasize genuineness without equally emphasizing empathy and regard, you get cruelty. If you trust the group process without maintaining ethical boundaries, you get chaos. There's also the measurement problem. Rogers wanted to make therapy scientific, but the variables he studied, empathy, genuineness, unconditional positive regard, resist quantification. Rating scales measure behaviors that correlate with these qualities, not the qualities themselves. You can count empathetic reflections, but that's not the same as empathy. You can measure consistency between stated and actual feelings, but that's not genuineness. This hasn't stopped researchers from trying, but it creates a persistent gap between Rogers' phenomenological understanding, the felt experience of being empathetically met, and his empirical claims that we can measure this objectively. The lived reality of therapeutic transformation resists the kind of operational definitions science requires. Critics also note Rogers' theories lack developmental sophistication. He wrote as if humans are basically the same across lifespan. Same actualizing tendency, same need for conditions of worth removal. But child development research shows infants need structure and limit setting, not just acceptance. Adolescents need both autonomy and containment. Elderly clients might need life review and meaning-making, not growth toward potential. Rogers' approach works best with reasonably functional adults seeking personal growth. It works less well with children needing developmental guidance, severely impaired adults requiring active intervention, or people in acute crisis needing directive support. The spiritual vagueness is another issue. Late-career Rogers wrote increasingly about transcendence, mystical experience, and consciousness evolution. But he never clearly articulated what this meant or how it integrated with his psychological theories. Was he proposing a spiritual worldview, speculating philosophically, reporting subjective experience? The ambiguity left person-centered therapy vulnerable to New Age co-optation, his ideas blending into generic spirituality without critical grounding. Perhaps most problematically, Rogers never adequately addressed evil. His theory assumes people become destructive only when their actualizing tendency is blocked by conditions of worth. But what about sadism? What about people who seem to genuinely enjoy causing harm? What about systems of oppression maintained by people acting in their self-interest rather than from woundedness? Rogers' psychology has no room for genuine malevolence, only misguided actualization. This feels inadequate when facing genocide, systematic torture, or abuse that seems to stem from something darker than blocked growth potential. The economic critique matters too. Person-centered therapy requires time for the relationship to develop, for the client to access their wisdom, for change to unfold organically. But time is exactly what modern healthcare systems won't fund. Insurance companies want brief, manualized, diagnosis-specific treatment. Rogers' approach doesn't fit that model, which means it's increasingly available only to those who can pay out of pocket. This creates a class divide. Wealthy clients get relationally focused therapy that respects their autonomy. Poor clients get directive, protocol-driven treatment that maximizes efficiency. Rogers' approach, for all its egalitarian rhetoric, becomes a luxury good. There's also a generational critique. Younger therapists dealing with climate crisis, economic precarity, and systemic injustice find Rogers' focus on individual authenticity and personal growth tone-deaf. While he emphasized self-actualization, the planet burns. While he advocated organismic trust, capitalism exploits that trust. His theories feel complicit with neoliberal individualism, the idea that if we just work on ourselves, social problems will resolve. That's not fair to Rogers, who did piecework and cared about social change, but it reflects real limits in his theorizing. He never adequately connected individual psychology to collective liberation, never developed a political psychology that could address systemic violence and oppression. These criticisms don't negate Rogers' contributions, but they complicate his legacy, showing where his theories need expansion, revision, or integration with other frameworks. Modern person-centered practitioners increasingly blend his principles with trauma-informed care, anti-oppression analysis, attachment theory, and neuroscience, creating richer, more nuanced approaches. Rogers himself would probably welcome this. He always said his theories should evolve through experience, that he might be wrong, that clients would teach us what we need to know. So perhaps the fairest assessment is this: Rogers was brilliantly right about some things. Relationship quality matters enormously. Limited on others, individual focus misses systemic issues, and wrong about a few. The actualizing tendency alone isn't sufficient for all healing. The task for inheritors of his work is keeping his insights while addressing his blind spots, maintaining his optimism about human potential while acknowledging real limits, preserving his respect for client autonomy while recognizing some people need more than acceptance to heal. The farm boy philosopher got a lot right, but not everything, and acknowledging both the brilliance and the limitations honors his actual legacy better than uncritical veneration ever could. Chapter 15. The Quiet Revolutionary's Enduring Questions. As we near the end of our bedtime journey with Carl Rogers, let's ask what remains. Not what survived perfectly intact, but what questions he posed that still need answering. What unsettled certainties that remain unsettled. What radical challenges his work poses to psychology, therapy, and human connection in our current moment. The central question Rogers never stopped asking: what if we trusted people? Not naively, not absolutely, but fundamentally. Trusted that beneath the defenses and symptoms and confusion, people contain wisdom about themselves. That they're the experts on their own experience. That given the right conditions, they'll grow toward health. This remains radical. Our entire mental health system is built on expertise residing in professionals. Psychiatrists who diagnose, therapists who treat, researchers who determine what works. Rogers inverted this. The client knows. The professional's job is creating conditions for that knowing to emerge. We haven't fully reckoned with this challenge. We've absorbed Rogerian techniques, reflective listening, empathy, while maintaining non-Rogerian power structures, experts who know better than clients what they need. The radical trust Rogers advocated still threatens professional authority, institutional control, insurance-based healthcare. Related question: what if relationship is the intervention? Modern therapy has splintered into hundreds of modalities, each claiming unique mechanisms of change. Rogers argued there's one essential mechanism: the quality of the therapeutic relationship. Everything else, techniques, theories, interventions, are secondary to whether the client feels genuinely met, accepted, understood. Research increasingly supports this, but we haven't organized practice around it. We still train therapists in techniques rather than ways of being, still credentialed based on knowledge rather than relational capacity, still reimburse for procedures rather than presence. What would mental health care look like if we took Rogers seriously? If we selected and trained therapists for their capacity for empathy, genuineness, and non-judgmental acceptance rather than their mastery of treatment protocols. Another persistent question. How do we remain authentic in systems designed to make us perform? Rogers lived this tension. The authentic revolutionary working in academic institutions requiring professional conformity. His life's arc bent toward greater congruence, but the struggle was real and costly. We inhabit this tension exponentially more. Social media demands performative authenticity. Workplace culture requires enthusiastic conformity masked as individuality. Even therapy has become professionalized performance. The right words, proper boundaries, appropriate interventions. Rogers would ask, what's the cost of this incongruence? What happens when we split ourselves between inner experience and outer expression? And how do we create spaces where genuine encounter becomes possible? There's also the unresolved question of evil and harm. Rogers believed people become destructive when their actualizing tendency is blocked. But the 21st century keeps presenting examples that complicate this. Systematic oppression maintained by people acting in their self-interest, abuse that seems to stem from power rather than woundedness, environmental destruction driven by profit rather than trauma. Can Rogers' optimistic anthropology survive contact with human capacity for cruelty? Or does person-centered psychology need a shadow side? Acknowledgement that some people, in some contexts, need more than empathy and acceptance. That boundaries, consequences, and sometimes protection from harm are necessary before growth becomes possible. The questions about measurement and science remain open. Rogers wanted to prove humanistic therapy worked scientifically. But can we measure what matters most? The felt sense of being understood, the moment of genuine encounter, the subtle shift when someone accesses inner wisdom? Or does the attempt to quantify these experiences reduce them to something less than they are? Maybe both. Maybe we need multiple epistemologies, scientific studies showing therapy works, plus phenomenological accounts of what it's like to experience healing. Rogers tried to bridge these, but the bridge remains rickety, contested, incomplete. There's the urgent question of scale. Rogers' approach is intimate, time-intensive, relationship-dependent. But mental health crises are collective, massive, systemic. How do we scale empathy? How do we create conditions for millions of people to feel genuinely seen and accepted, when the systems producing psychological suffering, capitalism, racism, patriarchy, environmental destruction, remain intact? Can person-centered principles inform social movements, not just individual therapy? Can we apply Rogers' insights about growth-facilitating conditions to communities, institutions, societies? Or are there fundamental differences between individual and collective psychology that limit what his theories can address? The digital age poses new versions of old questions. Can AI simulate genuine encounter? Does presence require physical proximity? How do we maintain authentic connection in increasingly mediated relationships? Rogers couldn't have imagined these challenges, but his framework for thinking about them, what conditions facilitate genuine human meeting, remains relevant. Perhaps the deepest question Rogers posed: what does it mean to become a person? Not just an individual, we're born that way, but a person, fully conscious, genuinely authentic, congruent between inner experience and outer expression, actualizing rather than conforming. How does this happen? Can we facilitate it? What gets in the way? Rogers spent his life exploring these questions. In therapy rooms, encounter groups, peace workshops, his own marriage. He didn't find final answers, who does? But he developed a rich phenomenology of the journey. The pain of incongruence, the risk of vulnerability, the relief of being accepted, the gradual trust of inner wisdom, the expanding capacity for authentic relationship. This remains his greatest gift, not techniques or theories, but a map of becoming, a description of the territory people traverse when they move from defended, role-playing existence towards something more genuine, more alive, more fully human. As our evening with Carl Rogers winds down, we're left with his enduring invitation. What if you could trust yourself? What if you could be genuinely known and still accepted? What if your own experience, carefully attended to, contains wisdom about how you need to grow? Simple questions, profoundly difficult to live into, and perhaps more essential now than ever. In a world of algorithmic manipulation, attention capitalism, and manufactured consensus, to have the courage to trust what Rogers called organistic experiencing, your actual, felt sense of yourself and the world before it's filtered through others' expectations. The quiet revolutionary died in 1987, but the revolution he started, trusting people to become themselves, continues in every therapy session where someone feels genuinely met, in every classroom where a teacher creates space for authentic learning, in every conversation where someone listens not to respond, but to understand. The questions remain open. The answers are still being written. And that's exactly how Rogers would want it. Not a finished system, but an ongoing inquiry, forever becoming. Epilogue. The spectre that still listens. And that's the story of Carl Rogers, the farm boy who turned listening into a science and acceptance into a revolution. Before you drift off to sleep, let's retrace his extraordinary journey through the landscape of humanistic psychology. We began on an Oak Park farm where a quiet boy watched potatoes grow and intuited something radical. Given proper conditions, organisms actualize themselves. That insight, born from agriculture, refined through decades of clinical work, became the foundation for an approach that would reshape therapy, education, and conflict resolution. Then came the rebellion from fundamentalism. The seminary years where Rogers chose psychology over theology, not abandoning his deepest questions, but finding better tools to explore them. The Rochester years taught him that children, when truly heard, know what they need. That healing happens not through expert intervention, but through genuine encounter. Ohio State and Chicago brought the research revolution. Rogers proving that empathy and acceptance weren't just warm fuzz, but measurable, teachable, effective. The recordings, the transcripts, the studies that scandalized psychoanalysts and intrigued scientists. The systematic demonstration that relationship quality predicts therapeutic outcomes better than any technique. Wisconsin. The schizophrenia project that nearly broke him, teaching humility about his approach's limits. The painful lesson that actualizing tendency alone isn't always sufficient. The wisdom earned through partial failure that freed him for the work ahead. Through it all, personal struggles. The encounter groups, the peace workshops, the international work. Rogers taking his principles from the therapy room to conflict zones, insisting that empathy and authentic dialogue might create space for reconciliation. Seeing enemies recognize each other's humanity through careful facilitation of genuine encounter. Through it all, personal struggles. The marriage that had to evolve from traditional to authentic. The incongruence between public persona and private doubts. The lifelong journey toward the congruence he advocated. Helen's death. The final years exploring consciousness and transcendence. The peaceful acceptance of his own ending as one more growth opportunity. After his death, the paradoxical legacy. His specific approach fading from training programs, while his insights became so fundamental to good therapy, they're barely recognized as Rogerian. The quiet victory of ideas so thoroughly integrated they become invisible. So why does Rogers matter tonight? Because whether you're scrolling through carefully curated social media lives or sitting with the exhaustion of performing acceptability, his central question remains: what would it be like to be genuinely yourself? To trust that who you are beneath the performance is fundamentally okay. To encounter another human being without masks or pretense. The answers are still unfolding. In therapy rooms where clients risk vulnerability. In classrooms where teachers facilitate rather than dictate. In conversations where someone listens, really listens, not to fix or advise, but simply to understand. Now, as the candle of history flickers low, let's leave Rogers where we found him. Not in the British Museum like Marx, but in that counseling room in Ohio, early 1940s, learning to let go of expert authority and trust the person sitting across from him. Discovering that the most radical thing a professional can do is believe in someone's capacity to heal themselves. The rest, dear listener, is up to us. To practice presence in our increasingly mediated world. To create conditions where people can actualize. To listen, genuinely listen, in a culture that rewards performance over authenticity. If these journeys into history help you unwind, do us a kindness. Tap that like button, whisper subscribe, and leave a comment below. What stays with you about Rogers' story, and who should we explore next? Now close your eyes. Let these ideas drift. Trust, perhaps, that you contain wisdom about who you're becoming, and we'll meet again soon for another story. Sleep well.